So we're speaking with Linda Vigen Phillips, who is the author of Crazy, a young adult novel that releases October 20th from Eerdmans. Crazy is a novel in verse about mental illness, and it features Laura, a 15-year-old girl who is growing up in the 1960s. Can you tell us a little bit more about Laura and her situation?
Yeah, she was caught in a void, I guess. Her mother was having a series of nervous breakdowns. That's what they called it in those days, sort of mental collapses. And it was the era of non-communication, both within the family and out of the family. So she had a sister who was married and kind of out of the house, and a taciturn father who was Scandinavian, he was Norwegian, and so he didn't talk much. So she was virtually left to her own devices, and she was both afraid and shamed by what was happening in her house, but she didn't feel like she could talk about it to anybody, including her best friend. She just really felt isolated. So she had feelings of, she did consider suicide, but she bypassed that and became challenged to find out what was really going on in the family. She was motivated by the fear because she was afraid that she was going to come down with, as she put it, whatever her mother had. And she was driven to find out what that was. Mm-hmm. That was her salvation, really.
So you speak about Laura in the past tense. Am I correct in understanding that bits of this novel are autobiographical?
Yeah, very much so. After about 5 revisions, and each revision I hope and I think that I've stepped back objectively from it, but it is really the story of my mother and me. My mother did have bipolar disorder, but I did not know that official diagnosis until way into adulthood. That's when I started writing about it. But so during the time, as I said, I just knew, I was told that it was a nervous breakdown, and I saw many things that I couldn't explain or understand, and they really freaked me out. So, I try to speak about Laura, but yes, it's really semi-autobiographical.
So do you think, it sounds to a degree, well, I mean, it sounds very much, that Laura's situation is exacerbated by the era in which she is growing up in the 1960s, where mental health is not well understood or supported. Do you think Laura growing up now would have the same experience of that, or do you think that there have been positive changes in the way we collectively regard mental health?
You know, that's really an interesting question, Kate, because kind of to preface that, Eerdmans asked me to write a blog this week to respond to Robin Williams' suicide and to tie it into my book. And they've also reviewed my book and have discussed the fact that we've made and I agree with this, we've made tons of progress, particularly with psychotropic medication, with the drugs that they treat this with. But as far as stigma goes, as far as communication about it goes, I'm not so convinced that we've made wonderful strides. And I even read a study that said that psychologists and psychiatrists who treat this, even themselves, have somewhat of a biased stigma about bipolar patients, which I found very alarming. So, we've made strides, but I don't think we're there yet. And that was a great motivator in writing this book. I really would like it to be a conversation starter, a dialogue initiator, something that could keep people talking about it. Even now, with just an ARC out, it's not out until October 20th. The people that have read the ARC, I'm getting that response of, this is so firsthand. It's been in my family. We've not dealt with it. I'm getting that over and over. So I don't think it's necessarily 100% a 1963 phenomena.
Right. Can I ask you how long you've been writing poetry?
My father just loves poetry, and that's where I picked up the curiosity about it and the love for it. And so I really started writing poetry very young, probably with the advent of my first little diary with the little key that locked it up, kind of.
Right.
And I would have to say that it was very much my salvation during my teen years when I would to retreat to my room and write, because that seemed to be the only thing that helped me clarify things. And so it was just a natural. And so I started writing adult poems directly related to my mother's illness about 20 years ago, actually, and I soon had a collection of them and was about to proceed towards a chapbook when a friend of mine, my very really good writing buddy friend, read the 20 poems and said, this really needs to be a story. That's where the novel started.
Right. And so did you just naturally think to write in verse? You thought this will obviously be a novel in verse, or did you come around to that idea? Did you try prose first?
Oh, no. No. Like I said, I started with those 20 poems, and I never once tried to do prose. It just was, I think I've discovered that that's the way I write, the best anyway. And I did, I took those 20 poems and began a manuscript and went to the Chautauqua Highlights Foundation, Chautauqua workshop in 2009 and worked with Patty Gouch, who was the retired editor of Philomel. And she's the one that really helped me turn that adult voice of adult poems into a YA voice and a story. So that's kind of how it evolved.
I see. So you mentioned 2009. So how long has this book been in the works?
Yeah, well, if you want to talk about the inception of the first 20 poems, it's almost 20 years. I'm really dating myself here. But, it was,
right.
It never, like I said, it didn't start out to be a novel. And probably only in the last 7 or 8 years was I directly working towards that. But understand, in terms of today's time frame, that's still a long process.
Yeah,
but here I am. So never say no, right?
Yeah, right, of course. So do you think it was a therapeutic process for you, or do you feel like that sort of thing will happen once the book is out in the wild and it's, being read by people who...
Oh, very much therapeutic from the get-go, from the first 20 poems. It was a healing process, and I don't think I realized how much of a healing process it was until just recently, in the process of getting the book published and looking back on it and seeing how I've removed myself from it emotionally, and I can now talk about it and write about it and not feel like I'm going to kind of fall apart, because there was a time in my life when I really did feel like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go over the edge too,
Well, it sounds amazing. Do you have a snippet of it that you would read for us?
Sure. I can read one that is titled Nervous Breakdown, and it's really kind of the turning point when Laura's mother is in the throes of having the first breakdown. There are actually 2 breakdowns in the book, so this is the first one. If you've ever been there when a light bulb gets real bright just before it blows out, then you know what it was like around here when things got extremely crazy, right before they shipped Mama off to the nut house. It's all my fault for suggesting she take up painting again. That's what she was doing that day I came home to such a mess. She was trying to paint on canvas, not ceramics, and maybe, just maybe, she forgot how to do it, and it frustrated her real bad. I could see she was beside herself with frustration. I never should have suggested it. Maybe that's why she put her hand on the hot stove last night and didn't even smell the burning flesh. Now on top of her craziness, she has a bandaged hand. And then in the middle of dinner, meatloaf that Paula brought, she says in a perfectly normal voice, how long have I been like this? I wanted to think a miracle had just happened. But Daddy gave me a look that said, don't get your hopes up, and kept right on eating. A few minutes later, she stood up, knocked her chair over, and threw her plate on the floor, so I knew there was no miracle. Dr. Goodman calls it a nervous breakdown and says she'll be gone for maybe a month.